Sidak Atnakastan, Sidak Stephanie Carroll, Tishusta Slandak Melchina. Hello, I'm Stephanie Carroll. I'm Atna from the native village of Klutikal along the Copper River in Alaska, and I'm of Sicilian descent. I acknowledge the Tohono Nation on whose unceded lands I sit today in Tucson, Arizona, and the Pasco Yaqui tribe whose people also steward these lands. This presentation will discuss Indigenous data sovereignty and governance. Indigenous peoples data include data generated by Indigenous peoples as well as by governments and other institutions on and about Indigenous peoples and territories. Indigenous peoples data comprise information and knowledge about the environment, land, skies, resources, and non-humans with which they have relations. Information about Indigenous individuals such as administrative, census, health, social, commercial, corporate, and other data, and information and knowledge about Indigenous peoples as collectives, including traditional and cultural information, oral histories, ancestral and clan knowledge, cultural sites, stories, belongings, and more. Indigenous data sovereignty draws on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that reaffirms the rights of Indigenous nations to control data about their peoples, lands, and resources. Indigenous data sovereignty is grounded in inherent sovereignty, thus only Indigenous peoples and nations as rights holders can exercise Indigenous data sovereignty. Indigenous data sovereignty is a responsibility grounded in the ways, traditions, and roles that communities have for the care of their knowledge. Knowledge belongs to the collective and is fundamental to who we are as Indigenous peoples. Indigenous data sovereignty shifts the paradigm from equity to sovereignty and recognizes that data are critical to the exercise of tribal sovereignty. Indigenous peoples require data for governance and self-determined decision-making. At the same time, Indigenous nations, like many institutions, create and enact governance policies and practices that align with their values to accelerate the use of Indigenous data for equitable outcomes in decision-making. Indigenous-driven data work requires relationships and with other data actors and experts, both for expertise in data for governance, as well as through relationships where external data stewards manage Indigenous data by Indigenous standards. Both domestically and internationally, communities of practice and advocacy exist through Indigenous data sovereignty focused networks in the United States, Canada, Australia, and Aotearoa, New Zealand, as well as Indigenous data sovereignty activities in many other areas across the globe. The Global Indigenous Data Alliance, or GIDA, is an international network of networks that promotes Indigenous control of Indigenous data, reinforcing the rights to engage in decision-making in accordance with Indigenous values and collective interests. Released by GIDA, the CARE principles, collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, and their sub-principles set forth critical considerations for non-tribal data creators, stewards, and users, and are designed to guide the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in data governance across contemporary data ecosystems. The CARE principles bring a people and purpose orientation to data governance, which complements the data-centric nature of the FAIR principles, which are findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. The CARE principles shift the focus of data governance from consultation to values-based relationships. The CARE principles are designed to be complementary to the FAIR principles, to promote equitable participation and outcomes from data access, use, reuse, and attribution in contemporary data landscapes. Implementation of the CARE principles should be seen as a dimension of open and fair data that ensures the use of data is purposeful and enhances the well-being of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous data should be both fair and CARE. Currently, the vast majority of Indigenous data are neither fair nor CARE. In the critical era of open data, big data, and open science, Indigenous collections and data can be hard to find. They can be buried in larger collections, data sets, or repositories, and Indigenous data are often mislabeled, not properly attributed, and not searchable. Thus, Indigenous collections and data are not fair and do not perpetuate Indigenous provenance, protocols, or purpose. There's concern about implementing FAIR and CARE on already existing data, as well as instituting policies and practices to operationalize fair and care in the ongoing creation of new data. So we want to address both the volumes of data that already exist, as well as the vast volume of data that is created every single day. Important currently used mechanisms that can reflect and enact the CARE principles include tribal data governance tools such as tribal codes, guidelines, and research review processes. Also, items that show relationships between institutions, so data sharing, memorandums of understanding, and other types of agreements, and other institutional policies and procedures, such as policies that the federal government or universities or research repositories set out. Labels and notices, which are mechanisms for Indigenous communities to engage with cultural and research institutions to manage their rights over property and knowledge, are also another type of tool. But more tools are needed, as well as methods to assess and evaluate how these other institutions are enacting the CARE principles. There's much work to be done. Importantly, CARE needs to be applied across the data life cycle through laws, institutional policies, and ethical changes, and in durable changes to data infrastructures that persist throughout the data lifecycle. I encourage you to listen to the other talks and lightning talks to learn more about data and research governance efforts related to Indigenous data sovereignty. Thank you and have a great day.